Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Friday the 23rd of August in London. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Kriti Gupta. Coming up today, Kamala Harris vows to be a president for all Americans as she accepts the Democratic nomination.
Federal Reserve officials argue that gradual rate cuts should begin soon, ahead of Jerome Powell's Jackson Hole speech.
Plus, just weeks after being cleared on fraud charges, the British tech tycoon Mike Lynch confirmed to have died in the sinking of a yacht off the Italian coast.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Vice President Kamala Harris has formally accepted the Democratic presidential nomination and delivered a convention speech that set out her vision for leading the United States. Building on her background, Harris sought to offer a unifying message to voters.
I know there are people of various political views watching tonight, and I want you to know I promise to be a president for all Americans. You can always trust me to put country above party and self.
Harris used much of the speech to contrast her agenda with that of her Republican rival Donald Trump, who she said would only prioritize himself. In a lengthy critique of the former president, she described him as an unserious man who presents a serious threat to democracy.
Kamala Harris also vowed to prioritise the fight for the middle class and Americans' reproductive rights. Framing the debate over the issue as a fight for freedom, the Vice President warned the crowd about what she believed another Trump term would mean.
He plans to create a national anti-abortion coordinator and force states to report on women's miscarriages and abortions. Simply put, they are out of their minds.
Although light on policy detail, the Democratic nominee said she would pass a middle-class tax cut that would benefit more than 100 million Americans and provide more access to capital for small business owners. Harris's speech caps an extraordinary candidate swap that had her pick up the mantle from President Joe Biden following his disastrous debate performance just weeks ago. The latest polling suggests Harris has a slim but growing lead in the polls, although still within the margin of error.
The yen rose after Bank of Japan Governor Kazuo Ueda signaled the central bank is still on the path to raise interest rates. Speaking in the country's parliament, Ueda said the BOJ's stance had not changed, provided inflation and economic data continue in line with its forecasts. The comments come after his deputy had sought to reassure markets that further hikes would depend on the state of the market. In July, the central bank's rate increase triggered a massive sell-off in global equities.
Two Federal Reserve officials say they believe it's appropriate for the US Central Bank to begin lowering interest rates soon. Boston's Susan Collins and Philadelphia's Patrick Harker both called for a, quote, gradual and methodical series of interest rate cuts to start in September. That chimes with market thinking, where investors are pricing in rate cuts at each remaining meeting this year. But Kansas City Fed President Jeffrey Schmidt told Bloomberg he wasn't ready yet to support a cut.
This mandate on the inflation side's really important. I think we seem to be getting some really good movement that direction. But before we act, at least before I act or recommend acting, I think we need to see a little bit more.
Despite Schmidt's caution, minutes from the Fed's last meeting show a vast majority of policymakers expected to start easing in September. Investors will be listening closely for any hints about how quickly policymakers expect to move when Fed Chair Jerome Powell speaks later.
Nestle CEO Mark Schneider is being replaced after 8 years running the consumer goods giant. The company's Latin American chief, Laurent Frakes, will take over the top job starting next month. Bloomberg's James Woolcock has the story.
It was a surprise move. Mark Schneider was set to speak at 3 different events next week before his departure was announced. But he's not alone. Former CEO of Unilever, Alan Jope, stepped down last year.
Winning in fast-moving consumer goods doesn't come from doing one thing right. You have to do lots of things right all the time, every day.
And just last week, another boss was felled.
A new leader on the way for Starbucks. The coffee chain has named Chipotle Chief Executive Brian Niccol as its new CEO and chairman.
Bloomberg data shows 6 of the largest consumer companies have announced new CEOs in the last year. The changes at the top speak to a sector trying to win back the confidence of investors in a difficult market. Consumers globally are keeping a tight grip on spending after post-pandemic price rises and high rates. In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
UK consumers are becoming increasingly optimistic about their personal finances since the Bank of England's first rate cut. GfK says the households' perceptions of their financial situation and their willingness to spend both rose in August. The British economy has outperformed all of its group of 7 peers so far this year, with growth of 0.7% in the first quarter and 0.6% in the second.
Mike Lynch, the tech entrepreneur dubbed the British Bill Gates, has died, aged 59. Bloomberg understands the businessman did not survive the sinking of a yacht in a severe storm off the coast of Italy. Giovanni Costantino, boss of yacht company, the Italian Sea Group, says the incident was mismanaged.
The storm is on the weather charts that everyone could read. The event was absolutely readable and expected. First of all, everyone had to be in the assembly point, which is in the main lounge, not in the cabins.
Giovanni Costantino from the Italian Sea Group there speaking through a translator. Now, a small group of Lynch's advisors were on board the vessel celebrating his recent acquittal on fraud charges. During his career, the tycoon co-founded Autonomy, the UK's second largest technology company, and advised 2 British prime ministers. He was described as, quote, one of the brightest minds the technology sector has ever seen by Luminance, a company he helped found.
Now, in a moment, we will look ahead to that key speech by Fed Chair Jerome Powell at Jackson Hole and reflect on the life of British entrepreneur Mike Lynch. But let's start, Critty, in Chicago. Kamala Harris accepting the Democratic Party's nomination for the presidential race, capping off the convention that we've been talking about all week on the programme. I mean, there was lots going on in that hall, quite frankly, building up to this huge crescendo for Kamala Harris. I mean, you know, you can take your pick of the fun facts. Apparently 100,000 red, white and blue balloons fell on the convention after her speech ended. You know, there was obviously a huge amount of organisation that went into it. Beyonce wasn't there in person, despite some rumours that were circulating online, but it was her song Freedom that Kamala Harris walked onto stage for and came off stage as well. And I liked this, that it was 39 minutes long, her speech, which was half as long as Donald Trump's to the RNC. So there you go.
Can I give my own fun fact there?
Please.
My favorite little snippet of it was that the 2 stars of the show Scandal were there. Kerry Washington and her co-star who played as the president of the show. Yeah. They made a little on stage appearance. My favorite bit. Yeah, besides the nomination, of course.
Indeed, of course. Well, let's get into the content of the speech then. I mean, this was a big moment for Kamala Harris. There were lots of comparisons being made to, of course, when she accepted the vice presidential nominee 4 years ago. I'm interested in your thoughts on this, Critty. This is obviously a story that you've been living inside and out for a long time. When you listen to what Kamala Harris was saying, do you felt that she rose to the occasion, I suppose, in this time around?
Well, she's sticking to kind of the messages that are resonating with the people. It's a very clearly choreographed campaign in that she knows her weak points. So she's speaking to. She actually very quickly did mention the Gaza conflict as well, which I think she's largely been avoiding. We'll get to that in a moment. But she's sticking a lot to that kind of making America affordable for the middle class narrative. So she really harped on things like what a Trump tax cut might look like for the wealthy. She actually advocated for a middle class tax cut. Now, it's unclear if that's an actual tax cut or if she means that through some of the measures that she's doing, it would equal the same savings as a tax cut. But the fact that she's really harping on the idea of housing affordability, price gouging in terms of groceries, price gouging in terms of prescription drugs, those were all things that were mentioned, even in her nomination, and have been mentioned all week long by her allies. Yeah,
indeed. So there wasn't any major new policy announcements, but it is interesting, as you pointed out, that she did talk about the war in Gaza. This is an issue that's been quite controversial at the convention. There have been protests outside. There's been lots of criticism that there wasn't enough said inside the convention hall about it. What did you make of the language that we heard from the Vice President?
Well, she stuck to the party line, but she did acknowledge it. And I have to say, this is, I think, maybe the first or one of the very few times throughout the DNC, this is day 4, basically, we're coming off of for the DNC, where you have actually have heard it being addressed. And this is largely something that the RNC certainly did not address from a Gaza perspective. So this is really interesting when it comes to that. What also really stood out to me is that the way she kind of described herself, she really used her speech as a way of explaining who she was. She's had so much written about her, so much by kind of being in the shadow of Joe Biden as kind of her VP. This was her opportunity to kind of create her own narrative about herself. And she did that, explaining that she's from a mixed background. She's from a lower income family. She had time at the prosecutor's desk in California. California, of course, during her time as Attorney General, even going to a point of talking about the immigration story and the border story. Again, no clear policy objectives, but just saying this is a issue where she's actively prosecuted on. So I think, again, she's highlighting the issues. It's a very conscious approach in terms of what the voters want to talk about: the economy, the border, reproductive rights. She didn't mention gun control there, but she did mention Gaza. So you are seeing that this is very, again, a choreographed take. Did she rise to the occasion? Perhaps. Do we still need to hear more about her policies? Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the language around Gaza was interesting because she talked about President Biden and her working to end the war so that Israel is secure, that the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and that the Palestinian people can realise their right to dignity, security, freedom and self-determination. So that was what we heard from the Vice President on that quite sticky topic. We talked about, the economy did feature in the speech, perhaps not as prominently as it could have, but thinking about what's next for the US economy. We've also got Jerome Powell speaking at Jackson Hole later on as well. We're looking at markets, very much expecting a rate cut from the Fed in September. It's been penciled in by many. What should we expect to hear from Jerome Powell that might either, confirm that or otherwise?
Well, reiterating a lot of that September rate cut kind of that we've talked about. It's already something that we saw in those FOMC minutes. In fact, so many participants actually wanted to cut back in July, and that was really seen as kind of the dovish maybe plot twist of the last 48 hours. I think what's really interesting about this one and this September rate cut is we really need to figure out what the reason for a rate cut is. Are we talking about normalization? Are we actually worried about a slowdown? If you look to a lot of financial experts right now, they're saying a 25 rate cut would be normalization. It's going back to everything. It's kind of coming back to the neutral rate. A 50 would signal panic. So that's the kind of line that Jay Powell has to walk. And it's also crucial that we're talking about it in fact of whether or not some of the data that we are seeing that is a slowdown. Is it a slowdown that could lead to a recession? I think Neil Dutta over at Renaissance Macro Group put it best, which is that not all slowdowns lead to a recession, but every recession starts with a slowdown. And it's Jay Powell's job to figure out where we are in that spectrum.
Yeah, indeed. And of what we've been hearing so far from those Fed officials like Susan Collins and Patrick Harker, as well as this gradual and methodical approach to rate cuts as well. So that's what will be in focus. We'll, of course, bring you that speech from Jerome Powell later on Bloomberg Radio. We're also going to be hearing from the likes of Andrew Bailey from the Bank of England, is giving a speech in Jackson Hole as well, 8 p.m. London time for that. And the ECB's Philip Lane will be speaking on a panel later today as well. So plenty more to come from Jackson Hole throughout the day. Let's turn to some other news now, and the British tech entrepreneur Mike Lynch has been confirmed dead after the yacht that he was on sank off the coast of Italy. Also among the confirmed victims was Jonathan Bloomer, the chairman of Morgan Stanley International, his wife Judy, Chris Morvillo, who was a defence lawyer who'd represented Mike Lynch, and Morvillo's wife Nada. Now Lynch's daughter Hannah is among those missing from the yacht. Bloomberg's Tua Adebayo is here with more on this story. We had the confirmation that Mike Lynch was indeed on board that yacht and that he did die in that storm. How will he be remembered, Tiwa?
Well, our own reporting has characterised his career as impressive but also unfinished. There's no doubt about the impact that he made on the technology sector. He was known as the British Bill Gates. He co-founded Autonomy, the UK's second largest software company, which he went on to sell for $11 billion. He then set up a venture capital firm, which churned out even more successful tech companies, including Darktrace. So in terms of recognition, he was also really well respected by peers in the world of tech. He was named Entrepreneur of the Year by the Confederation of British Business, for example. And outside of the tech sphere, he advised 2 British prime ministers. He was also a non-executive director of the BBC and received an OBE for services to enterprise. But as one tech analyst put it aptly yesterday, he said goodness knows what he could have achieved next. There is this sense of his career being cut short, of course, in a very tragic way. So that too will be part of how he is remembered and part of his legacy. The question really of what might have been.
Tiwa, Mike Lynch had been celebrating his acquittal in a criminal trial in the United States over HP's purchase of his company Autonomy. What had he been accused of?
Yeah, well, part of the reason why his career is being described as upended is this decade-long fraud case that he was acquitted from just 10 weeks ago. It's a case that actually saw him extradited to the US after he was accused by Hewlett-Packard of boosting the financial results of autonomy during the sale. He was ultimately found guilty of that in the United States, but there was a UK-based civil case about this which came before that. It was one of the longest and most expensive trials in British history. It actually did end up with a judge ruling that he had fraudulently boosted the value of his company in 2022. And it's something that really affected him until the very end of his life. Actually, when he died, he was still waiting to hear how much he'd have to pay in damages in that UK civil trial as well.
What do we know about what he was planning to do next, or what his peers were saying about him?
Well, actually, after he did win that criminal trial in California, Mike Lynch did release a statement, and he said that he was looking forward to returning to the UK and getting back to what he loved the most, which he said was his family and innovating in his field. So you can only imagine that he did have significant professional plans in mind as well. But tributes have really been rolling in from the business world and beyond, actually. His autonomy co-founder said he was the brightest man I've ever met in my life. David Yelland, who's a former editor of the Sun newspaper here in the UK, was perhaps referring to his extradition to the US in that case, and said he was failed in life by his country and his peers when he needed them the most. We've also heard from Lord Brown, the former chief executive of BP, who said that Lynch was the person who catalysed a breed of deep tech entrepreneurs in the UK.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.